Hey guys, and welcome back for another historical debunking video. It seems like this genre of video is becoming a sub-series in itself, where I correct things that are taught to the world wrong. And I must admit, I was shocked when I learned that my knowledge on this particular story has been completely wrong for years. If the name Frank Abagnale Jr. doesn't mean anything to you, then maybe you'll recall the 2002 Steven Spielberg movie Catch Me If You Can, featuring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks, a film which I've always actually loved. The movie is based on and named after the 1980 autobiography of the same name, written by Frank Abagnale Jr., in which he details his life as a self-confessed imposter and con artist. As a young man, Abagnale claimed to have cashed $2.5 million worth of bad checks whilst impersonating a Pan Am pilot, a doctor, a teacher, and even an attorney. He even claims to have escaped from prison and to have been chased by the FBI for years, featuring on their most wanted list. A lot of people just take his word as the truth, and for years tales of the great imposter have been told over and over again, a story on which Abagnale has built a billion-dollar industry. But it seems that he might never have been a great imposter at all. He might have just been someone who was pretty bad at being a criminal, a shitty guy who gained notoriety on his tall tales. So let's dive into it all today. So this video was inspired by and is sponsored by this book, The Greatest Hoax on Earth, Catching Truth While We Can by Alan C. Logan. I was contacted quite a while ago about making this video, and I said I would read the book, do some research, and decide if it was something I wanted to talk about. I was already familiar with the public story of Abagnale, so I wasn't really sure what I was letting myself in for here. But let me just say that this book has completely opened my eyes, and I officially will no longer trust any story as somebody's word ever again. This incredible expose by Alan C. Logan shatters the legend of Frank Abagnale Jr. and reveals his elaborate con that has fooled millions for decades. Everything that we know, the book, the movie, even the Catch Me If You Can Broadway musical, that's right, were all based on nothing except Abagnale's own claims. He is a con man, just not the type that he claims to be. For decades, he's told the public stories of his life, his apparent incredible cons, and it doesn't seem like anyone really ever went to much effort to fact check his claims, until Alan asked the question, what if the story is the real con? The Greatest Hoax on Earth presents new evidence which pulls apart all of Abagnale's claims, using public records, arrest reports, court witnesses, National Archive file statements, local reporting, and even never-before-seen letters, all of which are referenced in the back of this book. There's no doubt that Abagnale was a criminal in his prime. He spent quite a few years of his life in and out of jail, but his crimes weren't anything to be proud of. He didn't scam huge multi-million-dollar industries. His criminal career was just a litany of small-time scams that affected regular people like you and me. And the best thing about this book? It's incredibly readable. I'm sure I've mentioned before that I really struggle with non-fiction books. I tend to read for escapism more than anything else. So if a non-fiction book doesn't capture my attention, it just doesn't stand a chance. And I'm really happy to say that I steamed my way through this one. I read it in just a few days, and then I read it again to write this video. I'm going to give you a general overview of Abagnale's crimes and claims and the subsequent debunking in this video, but if you want a really riveting deep dive into this case, I cannot recommend this book enough. I know this is sponsored, but honestly I wouldn't even agree to the video if I didn't think this book was great, and it's great. So let's begin by looking at Frank Abagnale's story as he shared with the public over the last few decades. He was born in the Bronx, New York on April 27th, 1948 to his parents Paulette and Frank Abagnale Sr., and he grew up in Bronxville until his parents divorced when he was 12. When he was 16, he began his life of crime. Not a life of being an imposter, a life of crime. Frank Abagnale Jr. came into the public spotlight in 1977 when he appeared in a popular TV show in the USA called To Tell the Truth. The concept of the show was pretty straightforward. You have panellists who are presented with 3 people, contestants, and one crazy story. 2 of the contestants are imposters, the story doesn't belong to them. The third one is telling the truth. The panel have a limited amount of time to hear the story and ask questions, and then they have to guess who the story belongs to. It's a really similar concept, I guess, to Would I Lie to You here in the UK. Abagnale featured on the show in 1977 when he wasn't even yet 30, where he told the story of how he's known as the world's greatest imposter. How over the years he's pretended to be a doctor, lawyer, college instructor, stockbroker and airline pilot. He said, "To become an airline pilot, I merely bought a plastic ID card for $5, affixed an airplane logo for a model plane hobby kit, and in no time at all I was a co-pilot for a major airline." As you can imagine, a story like this caught the audience's attention and the public's. No one on the panel was able to identify Frank as the one telling the truth. He walked away with $500 that day and a snowball was set in motion. The media started to show an interest in his story and he started sending photos of himself to media outlets for them to feature in their articles about him. Very little fact-checking was done. Each newspaper article written just took Frank at his word, believing that he was telling the truth. I mean, why would somebody pretend to be a criminal if they weren't? As the months went on, with each interview or engagement, Abagnale would add new details, fleshing his story out. He started to get picked up for speaking engagements across the UK, and by April 1978 was even picked up by The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Him and his story hit the mainstream, and eventually he got a book deal. By 1980, his book, Catch Me If You Can, was released, but it actually turns out the book was written around 1976 with the help of a ghostwriter and professional propagandist with Hollywood connections. In September 2002, Abagnale felt the need to post a statement on his official website saying, "I wrote the book Catch Me If You Can more than 23 years ago. Obviously, this was written from my perspective as a 16-year-old with the help of a co-writer. I was interviewed by the co-writer only about 4 times. I believe he did a great job of telling the story, but he also over-dramatised and exaggerated some of the story. That was his style and what the editor wanted. He always reminded me that he was just telling a story and not writing my biography. This story, which many have taken as fact, as a biography, is self-confessed as being a work of fiction. It's over-exaggerated." The most interesting part of this statement is that he refers to the fact that he was just 16 years old when his cons began, but of course that doesn't seem to be the case. New York state records prove that Abagnale was actually in prison for much of his teenage years, until he was 20 years old for stealing from local businesses. Every one of his public speeches claims that he began roaming the world as a teenage imposter, but this simply cannot be the case. In fact, even on his website he writes all of the crimes he committed were between the ages of 16 and 21, but as you'll see throughout this video, that is simply untrue. In a nutshell, his teenage years go as following. At age 16 in December 1964, Frank Abagnale joined the US Navy. Just 2 months later, he was discharged. Even before this point, he already had been accused of petty crimes in New York, ripping off small businesses, including a local dry cleaners. After he left the Navy, this just continued. In fact, within just days of arriving back home, Abagnale was forging checks and stealing once again, getting arrested for his crimes on the 25th of February 1965, just 1 week after he got home from the Navy. 2 weeks later, he was arrested again for vagrancy. On the back of this arrest, it seems he decided to leave New York. At this point, he wasn't dressing as a pilot though, that would come later. Instead, he stole a car at the end of May and then stole 3 blank cheques from a local service station. Still to this day, Abagnale claims that he never stole from individuals or small businesses, only large corporations. But sadly, that's just not true. He soon cashed these checks for close to $4,000 in today's money, and the Westchester police issued a warrant for his arrest. Undeterred, Abagnale drove the stolen car over state lines, a federal offence, and headed to California. He arrived in a town called Eureka and was soon arrested there again for check fraud and later the federal charge of transportation of a stolen vehicle. He was soon released on bond to the care of his father and was taken back to New York, this time via plane. On the 12th of July 1965, he made an appearance before federal court in Manhattan and was told to turn up for a hearing a few days later. Only he never did because he was back in custody again for another crime. This is a man who's publicly claimed that he'd only ever been arrested once in his life. But at this point in our story, he's 17 and has been in and out of custody more times than the majority of people will ever be in their lives. He was arrested this time for forgery, a case that the police have been building up against him even before his road trip to California. And very weirdly, at the time of this arrest, he was wearing a pilot's uniform, for reasons which you will soon come to understand. In a signed affidavit, Abagnale admitted to giving bad checks to a number of local businesses, to which he was sentenced to 3 years at the Great Meadow Correctional Institute in Comstock, New York. 2 years later, however, he was released on parole. You'd think this would have taught him a lesson, but of course not. His mother would later say that within a week of arriving home from prison, Frank was writing bad checks again. A little over a month after his release, he was arrested in Boston, Massachusetts for grand theft auto and small-time larceny by forgery. He was sentenced to another 6 months for the grand theft auto and was given a suspended sentence of 1 year and 2 years of probation for the larceny. He served 128 days and was then sent back to prison in Comstock for violating his parole. He was released eventually on Christmas Eve 1968. Frank Abagnale would later publicly claim that he committed most of his impressive cons when he was a teenager, as young as 16 years old. But as you can tell, he actually spent most of his late teenage years behind bars. He was 20 years old when he was released here. Even after this release, he would only be free for 6 weeks before being arrested again. But what he did in those 6 weeks is what it seems a lot of his later tales would be based on. Shortly after he was released, Abagnale scammed a few free flights on Delta Airlines dressed as a TWA, a Transworld Airlines co-pilot. It seems that he'd spent time in New York getting a pilot's costume tailored, planning for this scam, hence the previous arrest in a pilot's uniform. Now, this was obviously back in the 1960s, where security before getting on a plane wasn't quite what it is nowadays. He was able to work his way onto this Delta flight with a fake uniform and a passable ID card that he'd clearly also gotten made. The way this worked is if there was a spare seat in the cockpit, anyone working for any airline could make their way onto it, even competing airlines. Abagnale used this scam a few times before people figured out what was going on and reported him to the authorities. In the meantime though, he'd set his sights on a woman called Paula Parks, a flight attendant for Delta. Paula spoke to Alan Logan for the book, in which she described Abagnale as borderline stalking her, following her between airports in order to convince her to date him. She said, "This guy could talk and he was funny, a real smooth talker." Abagnale crossing boundaries with women would seem to be a recurring theme throughout these years of his life. Often he would speak of women as commodities, something to be prized. One day Paula told him that she was going to Baton Rouge to visit her parents, to which he said he would drive her. When they arrived, he immediately made himself comfortable, charming her parents, and he wouldn't leave again for a number of weeks, taking advantage of their southern hospitality, as he claimed to them that he'd been put on furlough as a pilot. In this time, he would steal checks from Paula's family and small companies around the town. This is a man who claimed to have been a millionaire by the time he was 21, but he was still stealing checks of innocent people and companies at that point in his life. As well as this, people had started to figure out this supposed furloughed pilot didn't work for TWA at all. On Valentine's Day 1969, he was questioned by detectives and couldn't quite get his story straight. They contacted TWA, who stated that they'd received numerous complaints about this man posing as a pilot over the previous few weeks, and so he was charged with vagrancy. As a repeat offender, he probably should have been looking at a lengthy sentence here, but instead he used his friendship with a local reverend to work in his favour. When it came to his sentencing, he was given 12 years for his theft and forgery convictions, but to be served on supervised probation, no prison. He was also to be given psychiatric treatment and was ordered to pay restitution to his victims. So what did he do? He left town. Soon, the judge ordered a formal bench warrant. But actually, in fact, he didn't even just leave town. Abagnale decided it was probably a good idea if he fled the country, and so he headed to Sweden, probably with the help of his airline costume. By the end of August in Sweden, he'd already stolen the car and issued a number of forged checks. A man called Jan Hillman owned an auto repair shop in Eureka when one day Frank turned up, asking if he could rent a car whilst his own was being repaired. He asked if he could take a car for a test drive, to which Hillman obliged. Only, of course, the car was never returned. Another regular person stung by his crimes. Soon he was on his way to France, where it wasn't long until he was arrested. Years later, Abagnale would claim that he eluded the authorities in Europe for months, leaving a trail of fake checks in his wake. As you probably figured out by now, that wasn't the case. He was arrested in France in September, where he was given charges of theft and swindling, and he was given just 4 months in Perpignan prison, but he served only 3 of these. He would later claim that he was starved during his time in a French prison, that he left weighing just 109 pounds, which would have left him skeletal at 6 foot. But people who saw him during this time said that his weight never looked different. Perhaps this was another exaggeration for his story. From there, he was extradited to Sweden to face his charges. He stood in front of a judge in March 1970 and was found guilty of gross fraud by forgery to serve 2 months in Malmö jail, and then deportation and an 8-year ban from re-entering Sweden. He would also be required to pay back the regular people he had conned, something which the Swedish victims claim he has never done. Frank Abagnale was deported back to the USA in March 1970, so much for months of evading the authorities. One of his greatest claims is that he wrote $2.5 million worth of bad checks. And it's not a lie that he did actually run scams involving Pan Am checks, but was a whole lot smaller than it claimed to be. The entire thing ran for only a few weeks and earned him just a grand total of $1,448.60, a far cry from the alleged $2.5 million. There were 10 checks in total, with Abagnale taking personal checks and dressing them up to look like Pan Am paychecks, adding the logo. The first of these 10 checks was cashed in Durham on July 31st, 1970, made out for just $108.16. Despite claiming on his website that all of his crimes were committed between the ages of 16 and 21, if my calculations are correct, this makes him 22 at this time. And of course, with this being a paycheck that Abagnale forged, it didn't take long until Pan Am took notice. Only around 6 weeks, at which point they contacted the FBI. And because he didn't use a fake name on the checks, it was pretty easy to track him down. It was the 2nd of November 1970 when Abagnale was apprehended in a cheap motel in Cobb County, Georgia. There weren't years of a cat and mouse chase with the FBI sniffing at his heels, as his autobiography and movie both suggest. It was just a number of weeks, and he was taken to Atlanta where he was initially given a $5,000 bail, but no one bailed him out. He was in the Cobb County Jail for 3 months whilst he awaited his federal trial, and to be fair to him, he did manage to escape for a couple of days. Abagnale's made big claims about escaping from penitentiaries, evading high security. He never quite did that, but he did escape a local jailhouse, just slipping past the deputies in a booking room whilst they were doing paperwork. He ran to New York but was quickly apprehended whilst trying to cash another Pan Am check there. He just didn't seem to learn. He was held in jail in New York City for 6 weeks before being delivered back to Atlanta, where he was soon pleading guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and was given a 2-year sentence for the escape, although he didn't end up serving anywhere near that, of course, being given supervised probation in 1973. He was 25 years old when he was released and paroled to Houston, Texas. Now, if you've heard of Frank Abagnale before, the scam you're probably most aware of is the pilot scam. I mean, it's the most impressive one, isn't it? Flying around the world for free is something that most people can only dream of. And there's no denying that he was definitely able to scam a few flights until the authorities became aware of what he was doing. But over the years, he's also made claims of scamming his way into a number of other professions as well, all of which are just that, claims. He claims that around 1966, he was the chief of pediatric residents at Cobb County General Hospital. Cobb County just so happens to be the same place that he was apprehended for his Pan Am check frauds. He said that he supervised the night shift at the hospital, that he would just watch other doctors and copy them, pretending to write in the medical charts. However, this is a job role that never actually even existed at the time, and no one at the hospital has ever heard of him besides from his lies. From 1977 up until his film was released, he told media and audiences that he was a doctor for about a year. In more recent versions of his story, he says that it was only for a few weeks. He tends to claim that, of course, the hospital and all the other businesses would deny that they ever had an imposter in their midst because it looks bad for them. But even if that is the case, which it isn't, he was literally in prison in New York at the time he claims to be running this imposition. He never pretended to be a doctor. And then there's the claims that he was a professor at Brigham Young University, saying that he would simply just stay one chapter ahead of his students. Again, of course, this was not true. No teacher who was there at the time has any recollection of Frank, and the records don't show him ever working there either. Not to mention that BYU is an incredibly religious university and not only requires your standard references, but also a reference from a recognised church leader. Abagnale wouldn't have had any of that. He would later release a photograph of this time of his life as a college professor, but even this photograph has been debunked. There's a soda can sitting on the desk in his classroom that didn't even exist yet. It had been faked. Very similar can be said of his claims that for a period he worked as a lawyer for the Baton Rouge Attorney General, claiming that he practiced law for about a year when he was 19. Once again, not possible. I mean, even if you don't take everything else into account, the fact that he had no education in law or any qualifications, he was in prison at this time. This attorney story was thoroughly debunked by 2 separate journalists in 1978, after Abagnale's appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. The actual Attorney General of Louisiana noted that his claim itself was the con. Abagnale would later claim that he went on the straight and narrow for good after his release on probation in 1973, but shock horror, that was not the case. Within just a number of months, he was arrested again for stealing from a kids' camp near Houston, where he'd managed to get a job working as a camp bus driver. He said again that he was a furloughed pilot looking for work. He said he wanted to work with kids, and so he got the job. He was 26 years old at this time, a far cry from the 16 to 21 he said he was when he committed all of his crimes. Luckily for Abagnale, the judge was lenient for these latest crimes and he was ruled to pay restitution for the stolen goods, which, to be fair to him, he actually did do this time around. From there, it seems that he finally went on to get a legit job, but one that he still falsified records to get, working with vulnerable children. This seems to be quite a theme for him. He's constantly telling people that he wanted to work with vulnerable children. And maybe he did genuinely want to, maybe this was his calling, but he couldn't quite stay away from crime long enough to follow his dreams. Abagnale was still on parole at this time, following his release from prison, and his parole officer soon found out that he'd taken a role that he was nowhere near qualified for, placing children in foster homes. And so he's ordered to resign from the position immediately. Luckily, this parole officer seemed to be fairly soft and allowed him to get away with much more than he probably should have done. Any other officer probably would have sent him back to prison. In 1975, Abagnale then gets another legit job, this time one that he does seem to be qualified for. Only he ends up getting sued for cheque fraud once again. Old habits die very hard. A few months later, he registered his own company, Frank W. Abagnale and Associates. Around this time, he would start holding anti-crime seminars, which is pretty ironic, but he claimed that his life of crime was now behind him and he turned a new leaf. And then his claims of working for the FBI start to come out. From what I can gather, there doesn't seem to be any way that we can be 100% certain that he wasn't working for the FBI. But what we do know is that around this time, Paula Parks, who was the Delta flight attendant I mentioned earlier in the video, was actually questioned by the FBI as to Frank's whereabouts. If he was working for the FBI at this time, they probably wouldn't be trying to find out where he was. And of course, the people who worked for the FBI were unable to confirm the claims. From there, this is when the public story, this imposter narrative that most people know of, began to take form. He started telling his embellished version of events at speaking opportunities around Texas, before eventually getting on the TV with To Tell the Truth. That episode on YouTube has now been viewed over 1 million times. This was a story told 44 years ago that has turned into a Hollywood blockbuster, a billion-dollar enterprise. Even 44 years ago though, there were some skeptics, journalists who tried to investigate the claims, but their stories were met with deaf ears. I mean, this was a time before social media, a time when word couldn't be spread as easily as it is now. There's no denying that Abagnale is a con man, but by no means is he this great imposter that he's built his empire on. He was just a criminal. Perhaps you could say he's an imposter at being an imposter. He's claimed so many times over the years he never stole anything from regular people, that all of his scams were on big businesses. His Pan Am check scam is one of the things that he speaks about the most, and he did do that. It was just nowhere near to the extent which he claims. Most of his check scams came at the expense of small businesses or regular people. These are still lies that he speaks about on a regular basis. In 2017, these same lies are being told in that, as well as small white lies like this apparent prestigious private school that he attended as a teenager, and dozens of other small details like that, which are just embellishments, exaggerations. They didn't happen. I'm so glad that I was contacted to work on a video about this. Catch Me If You Can is a movie that I've seen so many times, and I've never questioned the narrative in that movie. I mean, you assume that some things are exaggerated, of course, for artistic purposes, but you'd think the general story was correct, especially as it claims to be based on a true story. It just goes to show that the truth is never as it seems. This book, The Greatest Hoax, is loaded with original source, police and court references. It's a thought-provoking reflection on why the truth matters in stories like this one. You might think, no harm done, this was decades ago. But the people that Abagnale burned are still alive, still seeing his story in the media, seeing him heralded as this great man, which just wasn't the case. Without a doubt, he's charismatic, he's a great talker, it's how he got to where he is today. But he had victims. If you find yourself intrigued by this video, then there are hundreds of pages of more detail available in this book. It's engaging and entertaining whilst focusing on the victims, and it reads like this mystery being unfolded. You just want to turn every page to find out what happened next. I honestly cannot recommend this book enough. After reading this, I found it so interesting to go on YouTube and watch Abagnale's speeches and just like pick out all the lies, just pick apart his story. He is so charismatic and he's built an industry on his lies. But they are lies, they shouldn't be taken at their words. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you know of any other stories like this, stories of which the public narrative is completely wrong, then please do let me know. I'm finding doing videos like this at the moment so interesting. And I suppose I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.